Good morning. I will be serving as moderator today. My name is Yoshitaka Mōri. Thank you very much for taking part today. And right at the beginning, the Graduate School of Global Arts, Tokyo University of the Arts, Professor Kumakura will be making some opening remarks over video. Unfortunately, she was called away. She planned to take part, but she was unable to. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Dean of the Graduate School of Global Arts at the Tokyo University of Global Arts, Sumiko Kumakura. On behalf of the Graduate School, I would like to say a few words on opening this event. I hear that many people have applied to attend today's special lecture. So thank you very much for signing in and tuning in despite this being early in the morning. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Claire Bishop for kindly accepting our request to give us this lecture. Everyone truly were looking forward to hearing from you directly. In Japan, also, we see art intervention activities. In Japan, it is usually called art projects. And I research and teach students about the practical aspects of this genre of art. My field of expertise is art management. Art management itself is all about carrying out art projects, and this does not require any special research, and I believe that it can be done by anybody. However, how do you do it again and again and repeat it? That is what we are researching at the university. And also, we want to see what impact cultural projects have on society. This is a theme that you cannot engage in at the sites of art management because people are too busy. Therefore, the university has a mission to carry out research. The theme of today's lecture is Interventions, the Art of Political Timing. I believe we will be hearing very intriguing and deep discussions. For people involved in art management, political timing is always causing dilemma. It is a difficult issue. And we expect that from today's lecture, we will be gaining many insights. So, Professor Bishop, thank you very much again, and I'd like to hope that the audience enjoys today's lecture.
Right, in that case, we would like to begin. And I'd like to make the opening remarks in English. And regarding the remainder, I'd like to moderate in Japanese.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Yoshitaka Mōri, Mōri Yoshitaka, Professor of Cultural Studies and Sociology at Graduate School of Global Arts at Tokyo University of the Arts. So this is the second day of a special lecture by Professor Claire Bishop. Yesterday we had a lecture for postgraduate students at our university, and today's lecture is, as you see, open to the public. So it is a great honor for us to have a special guest lecturer, Dr. Claire Bishop, Professor of Art History at the City University of New York. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Bishop, who has accepted our offer. We really appreciate it. I'm super excited now because over the last decade, Professor Bishop's essays and texts have been always influential and inspiring to those who are interested in contemporary art, particularly the relation between art and politics. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Bishop very briefly. Professor Bishop has two essays in early 2000, Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics, which was translated in Japanese as 敵対性と関係性の美学. And the another essay, The Social Turn, Collaboration and its Discontent, have been always reference point to our discussion on the socially engaged art and participatory art in relation to social movement and politics. Her book, Artificial Health, published in 2012, which was translated in Japanese in 2016 as Jinko Jigoku. And since then, it has been a seminal text not only to art students, but also to scholars of critical theory, cultural studies, or scholars of social movement or contemporary politics in Japan. Dr. Bishop has published also influential book, Radical Museology, which critically examines the transformation of museum in the age of neoliberalist capitalism. This is also translated in Japanese. So today, Professor Claire Bishop will deliver a lecture entitled Intervention, the Art of Political Timing, in which she examines the historical trajectory of the concept of intervention. This is particularly interesting to me because this lecture itself has a performative political timing in the context of Japan and in Asia. We are now living in a crisis. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the big crises, but under this pandemic condition, we are now facing a conjunctural crisis of politics, economy, society, and culture. For instance, the crisis of ecology or greedy neoliberal capitalism, the rise of ultra-right or far-right movement, historical revisionism, or maybe some of you know about the censorship issue, such as Aichi Triennial 2019, or maybe state militarization or authoritarianism in Asia. Coup d'etat in Myanmar could be the latest example. So in response to them, we see a variety of democratization movement in Asia, anti-capitalism, anti-globalism movement, or gender sexuality politics, such as Me Too movement or LGBTQ movement, and so on and so on. So under these conditions, recently the artists are becoming more and more engaged in politics to some extent. So I think Professor Bishop's lecture today will give us a lot of insight to how we should understand the relation between art and politics, or maybe how artists, or even we, should or can intervene into this conjuncture. So I think I shouldn't talk too much because we have some time to discuss after her lecture and have two discussants, art critic Shinya Sugawara and artist Koki Tanaka later. So I'd like to invite Professor Bishop to start.
Thank you, Professor Mōri. And thank you so much for this invitation to Tokyo and to speak to you all. Thanks to the interpreters who are doing an amazing job, and the tech crew, and of course, to all of you for tuning in. I know it's early on a Saturday morning there. Not ideal for listening to an art history lecture on a Saturday morning. For me, it's a Friday evening, also maybe not so appropriate. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And then I will carry on talking. Yeah. And let's do this. So this is new research, and it comes in the context of a book that's of essays about contemporary art since the 90s, loosely themed around attention. So if yesterday's lecture was about a sort of attention anxiety in the face of too much information in an installation, today this is about a different type of time, a fast time, seizing the moment, riding the attention economy. It's a very different relationship to time. So I'm going to start. It's in 3 sections, and actually maybe 4 sections. I've cut one, I'm just going to start. I should also warn you that it has a strong Latin American focus, and so I apologize if the terminology is sometimes a little confusing as we move between Portuguese, English, and Japanese. So on the night of 27th of April, 1979, the Brazilian artist group Tres Nós Três, the name translates into English as 3 knots or We Three, placed garbage bags on the heads of monumental statuary in the city of Sao Paulo and tied them closed with a rope around the neck. Aware that the gesture might not last long and thus be not seen by many people, the artist called up journalists and had alerted them to the fact that something strange had happened to public statuary in the city. Photographs of their intervention, which they titled Ensacamento, roughly translatable as bagging or hooding, appeared in several newspapers the next day, including the front page of the Diario de Sao Paulo. The statues comprised a full range of figures, celebrated writers and intellectuals, neoclassical Greco-Roman nymphs, military generals, and even the monument to the Banderas, a huge sculptural group at the entrance to Ibirapuera Park. Although the sculptures were diverse in their meaning, as a group, they represented what monumental statuary represents everywhere: authority, nationalism, political and artistic conservatism, power. As a constellation, they effectively functioned as symbols of the military dictatorship that had governed Brazil since 1964. So I'm starting with Ensacamento because it allows us to identify some important characteristics that come to mind when we think of a prototypical artistic intervention. One of these is the use of public space, the lack of official permission, a use of the media, the use of an everyday visual language rather than references back to art history, and a sense of timing, including here a speed of execution. And then I think also, and I will say more about this in due course, a certain political undecidability, or what maybe something akin to what Bruno Latour calls iconoclash. So each of these can be seen in Ensacamento. Firstly, the use of public space. At stake here is not just a rejection of the gallery system, but an active pursuit of a general audience outside the Sao Paulo art world. By using monumental statuary, the group sought to speak to the polis, including those who were the living equivalents of the authority embedded in the statuary. Ensacamento was a reclaiming of public space after a long period of its political foreclosure and even physical destruction by the far-right military dictatorship that had been in power at that point for 15 years. The dictatorship had encouraged a retreat to the private sphere, which it attempted to influence through a tightly controlled mass media. Working with monumental statuary thus signaled a break with the private sphere and a move back into civic space. Secondly, the artists didn't seek permission to make this intervention. So they were aware of Cristo in North America, wrapping public monuments and buildings, but they didn't follow his example of having a laborious process of obtaining official consent to undertake the work. Instead, Tres Nostres made a list of sculptures that could be easily reached without a ladder and an itinerary for driving around the city to complete the task in one night, so that this intervention could take everyone by surprise. Of course, during the 1970s, much experimental art in Latin America and Eastern Europe was unsanctioned and unofficial, but much of it took place in a private context. Ensacamento, by contrast, took place in public, flouting the idea that one should keep one's ideas hidden or out of public sight. The third point I want to make is about the use of the media. Expecting that the intervention would not be seen by many people or that the authorities would remove the bags quickly, the artists alerted journalists to the fact that something strange was going on with statuary in the city. Press coverage ensured that Ensacamento circulated in two ways. Firstly, as a cited action in the city, and then as an image in the press, where it could be understood as a gesture that had spread across the whole city. It was also expedient. The group didn't have funds to produce a printed record of their actions, but it was easy to buy a few newspapers and cut out the stories and professional photographs the next day for their own archive. Fourthly, I think there's this paradoxical legibility and at the same time undecidability of the gesture. It communicated immediately, although what it communicated varied according to one's location on the political spectrum. Ensacamento harnessed a widely recognizable visual language that didn't refer to art historical traditions, but to a contemporary social practice, in this case, putting a bag over somebody's head during torture. With hindsight, and especially to an audience on the left, the politics of Ensacamento now seems very clear. The black garbage bags, roughly tied around the heads of statuary, convey a sense of revenge, retaliation, and a return of the repressed, evoking thousands of political prisoners who had been disappeared by the regime, many of whom had been hooded and tortured. But at the time, especially to those on the right, it was perceived as an image of defacement and disorder. In the newspaper, for example, it was described as further evidence of moral degradation and the city falling into chaos and ruin. For both sides of the political spectrum, in Sacramento was a potent, violent gesture, but the politics of this gesture were less clear. Bruno Latour refers to such moments not as iconoclasm, but as iconoclash, a moment of desecration that is also creative and constructive. A symbolic form, in this case, monumental statuary, is re-semiotized. Destruction is suspended to produce a contested new image, evidenced, I think, by the very different responses that in Sacramento garnered from left and right. And the image that you're looking at here is the image that Latour uses to exemplify his argument. And it's an image of firefighters breaking the box containing the Shroud of Turin during a fire in Italy in the 1990s. So then finally, the question of timing and what I want to call political timing. In Sacramento was performed less than a month after the declaration of the process of abertura, or opening. This is the policy of political liberalization, or opening to democracy, which is generally agreed to have begun in February 1979 with the Amnesty Act. Now, this act set in motion the crumbling of the dictatorship, which finally ended 6 years later in 1985. But in spring 1979, however, it was unclear whether authoritarianism or democracy would prevail. The gesture of bagging the statuary is a product of this uncertainty and seizes this new structure of feeling, to use Raymond Williams' famous phrase. The artist seized a window of opportunity to reclaim public space, to mobilize the media, to focus attention and ignite debate. This means that in Sacramento was as much an intervention into its historical conjuncture, by which I mean the specific ideological, economic, cultural situation in which it arose, as it was into public space. So something I want to emphasize through this talk is that time is as, if not more important than space. So within Sacramento in mind, as a paradigmatic example of an intervention, I want to suggest that this way of working intersects with at least 4 pre-existing art historical terms, but without being reducible to any of them. Firstly, and most broadly, there's disruption, one of the central strategies of the historical avant-garde. Disruption can be aesthetic, challenging ideas of beauty, as in Duchamp's use of a urinal. It can also be semiotic, changing the meaning of something. And social, of course, as well, shocking and offending the public. Interventions often deploy disruption, but not always. The word derives from the Latin inter and venire, which means to come between. And this was originally used in the context of intercession or prayer in the Middle Ages, which suggests the possibility, I think, of a quieter mode of working too. A second term is actions. Much of what I'm going to be talking about has historically fallen under this term, actions, which was widely used before performance art became hegemonic in the late 1970s. Actions, like the term gesture, which I'm also going to be using a lot, has a neutrality that I want to push back on. Intervention, by contrast, suggests something active, pushing, probing, disrupting. Through this term, I also want to foreground the way in which intervention deploys widely recognized visual codes, rather than undertaking a series of extraordinary acts that we tend to associate with performance art. And my examples here are Milan Knížák in the Czech Republic in the 60s, and Shiraga in Tokyo in the 1950s, both of whom doing these kind of extraordinary, extreme performances. Against this kind of iconic, extraordinary gesture, I want to posit the everyday visual language. A third term that I want to push against is activism or artivism, catch-all terms for art that seeks to bring about social change. Now, I don't want to oppose interventions to activism, but I want to suggest that they constitute a subset. Both express resistance and dissent, but interventions tend not to be allied to a pre-existing cause and can often be more ambiguous and undecidable in their messaging. And then finally, there's site specificity, a way of working that arose in the 1960s in which the art object is understood as inseparable from its location. The actions I want to propose as interventions are closely related to site specificity, location always matters, but their concern is as much with time as with space. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be emphasizing time, the ancient Greek concept of kairos, the right moment, or the Renaissance concept of occasione. But these terms will be inflected with politics to arrive at a concept of political timing specificity. And this is a term that the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera has developed. And my use of this term is really indebted to our recent publication of Conversations Together. So this is not just a general sense of the times, but a precise intersection of ideological, economic, and cultural conditions, or what I called earlier the conjuncture, this term I take from Stuart Hall, who in turn takes it from Antonio Gramsci. It's noticeable that many interventions take place in moments of political or economic instability, when history is changing gears, right? When the situation is uncertain. Situations like the abertura, or opening, in late 1970s Brazil. So here are some other examples. Let's go to Moscow in 1991, where a collective of young artists began making rapid-fire actions in symbolically charged locations like the Red Square, the US Embassy, and the Monument to Mayakovsky. This group, known as the ETI movement, which stands for Expropriations of Art Territory, the group is widely acknowledged to have begun a new period in Russian art, centered on transgressive, raw, and visceral bodily actions in the newly accessible public space. As the Soviet system began to crumble, artists took advantage of the country's political chaos. On the 15th of April, 1991, members of the group, plus some passers-by, lay on the ground outside Lenin's mausoleum, the most sacred site in communist ideology, and spelled out the word dick, which is, in Russian it's pronounced hui, an expletive that frequently appeared in graffiti and was used to express political dissatisfaction. The action was a direct response to a law that had been passed 3 days earlier, prohibiting foul language in public. So the action lasted less than a minute before being broken up by the police, but it was photographed by members of the press and made it into the newspaper the next morning. So ETI's gesture was crude and impromptu, combining the highest symbolism, Lenin, his mausoleum, and the lowest, a coarse swear word. This intervention set the tone for much of Russian actionism that followed. Think of Oleg Kulik impersonating a dog, or Alexander Brenner wearing boxing gloves in Red Square, inviting Boris Yeltsin to have a fight. At least until the mid-1990s, Russian actionism staged a confrontation with power, using humor and obscenity to express the chaos of the transition from socialism to capitalism. Another example is Los Angeles in the early 1970s. The group ASCO worked in East Los Angeles just after the explosion of Chicano activism. And Chicano, for those of you who don't know, refers to Mexican Americans. It's also in the wake of the Vietnam War, for which a large number of Chicanos had been recruited and had died. The group created walking murals, urban performances, graffiti, and media interventions, often drawing on traditional Chicano imagery and rituals, but inflecting these with a sensibility that is equal parts rock star and carnivalesque. ASCO pointed out the absence of Chicano public space by inventing it, reversing the terms of exclusion with tactical hit-and-run interventions. In 1974, one of the group lay on the streets pretending to be a victim of gang violence. This is the image at the top here. The image was taken up by the media and reported as further evidence of the city in decay. ASCO claimed these public spaces, worked with speed and humor, and antagonized the media's perception of Chicanos as violent and disposable. Another example, Santiago, Chile, in 1988. The artist duo Las Yeguas del Apocalipsis, which translates as Horses of the Apocalypse, made interventions during the years of the democratic transitions from the Pinochet dictatorship, which had ruled the country since 1973. Within the context of a student strike, the artists, accompanied by 3 women, entered the university campus naked on horseback in order to refound the university. So the colonial foundation of the Latin American university, usually epitomized by the virile image of the conquistador on horseback, was replaced by the softer image of 2 completely naked and vulnerable men. In another intervention, this time interrupting a political debate in a theater in Santiago, the group stormed the stage wearing coats, heels, and tutus. In both instances, Las Yeguas pointed up the absence of public debate about gay issues and, of course, the AIDS crisis through a hyperbolic assertion of their own homosexual alterity. One more example, and this is in Cuba at around the same time, from 1986 to 89, in the wake of Fidel Castro's rectification policy, which itself was a response to Gorbachev's glasnost opening policy and perestroika. At this time, there arose a flurry of young artist collectives. Groups like Arte Calle, Grupo Puré, and Grupo Provisional were comprised of young artists, many still only teenagers, who undertook daring, irreverent actions in public space, and with huge popular support. Many of their interventions were not photographed, since they were unable to get hold of cameras and were anyway more interested in immediate experience than in documentation. In the lower of these two pictures, you see a young man, Aldo Damian Menendez, seated in front of the audience during a talk by Robert Rauschenberg. He's dressed as an indigenous Indian, undermining the tone of deferential, reverential welcome that accompanied the arrival in Cuba of Rauschenberg. In the top image, a member of Arte Provisional echoes this by carrying a banner bearing the image of an indigenous Indian and the barbed words, "Muy bien, Rauschenberg," very good, Rauschenberg. In all of these examples, we find actions that are site-specific, but with characteristics that exceed these art historical terms through their emphasis on speed and timing. Now, the words of Menendez, the guy in the lower image here, vividly conveys the tone of these urban interventions. He says, "We kept our projects secret and took advantage of any kind of event in the city to make surprise interventions in the way that one might prepare an assassination. We would study the site, the context, the kind of public, and the risk and implications of what might happen, and on that basis, we would plan our strike as a way of manipulating or altering reality violently to give it another meaning." So here again, we find these key components of an intervention that come up over and over again in this decade, in the 70s and 80s. The public sphere, a guerrilla attitude, the re-semiotization of reality, an element of secrecy and surprise, and disruption, of course, seen here through figures of violence like the assassination and the strike. So now, in this next section, I'm going to talk more about terminology and sort of how this word intervention starts to be used, how and when it begins to be used. So the Brazilian group Tres Nos Tres referred to their urban gestures as interversal, and you can see this word here on the screen, a word not widely used in Portuguese, but which carries the connotations of an inversion or subversion. It puns on the more familiar word in Portuguese, intervenção, intervention, which the theatre collective Viajou Sem Passaporte were already using to describe their actions in public space, this kind of intervention that you can see here. Other groups, more aligned with street art, use the word intervenção to describe their actions in public space, but then these are kind of include working on billboards rather than the more theatrical mode of Viajou Sem Passaporte. Or the first street art collective in Brazil, Tupinambá, who sought to valorize neglected spaces in the urban environment and subject them to collective interference, such as graffiti, but also dancing. At some point, seeking greater legibility for what they were doing, Tres Nos Tres also switched to using the term intervenção, bringing them into line with these other groups. Now, prior to this moment of the late 1970s, Brazilian artists had a range of terminologies for this way of working in the public sphere. One of them was, if you think of Helio Itasica, he was associated with a phrase like with propositions, proposição. Silda Morales is associated with insertions, interção. Another artist, Arthur Barrio, created these we would call them interventions in public space, but he referred to them as situations, situação. There are others as well, vivo dito, experiencia, and so on. So intervention existed alongside these other terms, proposition, insertion, situation, action, experience, to describe experimental work in this region. Although Brazilian artists had intervened in the media throughout the 1970s, inserting classified adverts into newspapers or altering the front pages, it was only around 1978-9 that intervention began to be used systematically, implying a way of working in public space that is rapid, temporary, disruptive, and either embodied or leaving a trace. Now, it seems striking to me that the use of this word comes from the specific situation of the global South, in a situation of military dictatorship, in fierce opposition to American imperialism, and as an assertion of resistance or refusal, often expressed through the defilement of public space, making it sort of polluted or dirty in some way. And I think it's even more striking that the term intervention in an artistic context arises at the high point of American military intervention in Latin America, which sought to crush the democratically elected leftist governments. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So in this foreign policy context, intervention seemingly refers to everything from coercive diplomacy to armed participation in civil war. But there have been important changes in how this category of interventions, political interventions or military interventions, are understood. At the turn of the 20th century, an intervention referred primarily to occupations and declarations of war. For example, the American occupation of Mexico in 1914, or its declaration of war on Germany in 1917. And it's in this latter sense of a declaration of war that Marinetti refers to futurist artists as the first interventionists in 1915, borrowing the self-descriptor of those in favor of Italy joining World War I. Now, he's not using the term in precisely the sense that I am, but I'm going to return to this at the end of my lecture. In the post-war period, intervention acquires the connotations of covert political maneuvering, particularly on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. This agency repeatedly sought to quash governments considered a threat to American interests and engineered anti-democratic coups throughout Central and South America. In the late 60s and early 70s, interventions began to acquire connotations of extra-legal interference, especially after the catastrophic failure of the American war in Vietnam and the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1972. In 1981, the United Nations passed a resolution forbidding any state to intervene in another state, and the term acquired unequivocally negative associations. In art, this moment can be seen in the flurry of works and installations and exhibitions indicting American intervention in Nicaragua and Guatemala by artist activist collectives like Group Material, shown here, or PADD. By the mid-1990s, however, the military intervention had undergone a complete rebranding. The magic word that accomplished this was the addition of humanitarian, first used during the Balkan Wars in former Yugoslavia. Interventions could now be perceived as altruistic, universalist, and protecting minority groups. Right? So we change from a sense of intervention as a declaration of war to intervention as covert military interference through to humanitarian intervention, which is seen as something benign. So this shift in definition of the understanding of intervention is found not just in foreign policy, but I think in art history too. The shift from covert machination to something institutionally sanctioned. In the first uses of intervention in Anglophone art criticism date from the 1980s, where the term slowly gained currency to cover a wide range of practices, from performances and gallery installations to any type of conceptual art in public space. It was applied to the outdoor installations of Daniel Buren, to the slide projections of Christoph Rosicko, and to the Guerrilla Girls, a feminist art activist group denouncing art world misogyny. But from the 1990s onwards, the artistic intervention started to change its meaning as it entered institutional settings. The first was the merging of urban interventions with the North American discourse of site specificity, public art, and installation. The biennial Insight, founded in 1992, even took interventions as its theme in 2005. Given the municipal and corporate investment that began to pour into biennials as a function of city branding, interventions rapidly lost their disruptive quality and drifted in the direction of sanctioned spectacle. The publication of this book, Erika Söderberg's anthology, Site, Space, Intervention, reflects this conflation of intervention with site specificity and installation art. The second change was the neutralization of intervention by museums, which accelerated in the early 1990s, largely in response to the growth of artist-curated exhibitions the previous decade. Working alongside museum curators, artists were invited to intervene in a collection and reorganize the museum's displays. The canonical example is Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum from 1992, in which he rehung several rooms of the Maryland Historical Society to draw attention to its repression of the history of slavery. The installation was, and continues to be, a paradigmatically contemporary exhibition in its radical, incisive, and affecting retelling of American history through one institution's overlooked objects. But what should have led to a thoroughgoing revision of museum practices, in fact, led to a glut of compensatory invitations, curators delegating to the artist the kind of critical gestures that they felt uncomfortable making themselves. So both biennial and museum interventions typify the ongoing model or the ongoing usage of this word. All are made in response to an invitation rather than being self-initiated. An artist or group is commissioned to make an intervention. A curator mediates on the artist's behalf, either with the museum or the urban infrastructure, and helps them to gain permission to make their work. This is a lengthy process that has nothing to do with the covert, unsanctioned guerrilla temporality of interventions as I want to redefine them. For what could be less disruptive than being invited to make a disruption? You can't curate carpe diem. So the fact that biennial and museum interventions are now the dominant mode of this artistic genre globally raises the question of whether or not it's possible for a term coined under the conditions of dictatorship in the global South can ever be comfortably inserted into a contemporary Western democratic context. For a long time, I thought the answer was no, but actually, I think the answer is yes, but we just need to adjust our frame of reference. At the same time as commissioned museum and biennial interventions were increasing in the 1990s, new forms of unauthorized media intervention were taking off. The term tactical media, coined in 1993, describes hit-and-run interventions in the new public sphere of the internet. While some were apolitical, other examples emerged under the rubric of electronic civil disobedience. Groups like Electronic Disturbance Theatre and the Yes Men used guerrilla tactics to inconvenience governments and multinational corporations by either jamming their websites or interfering with their brand identities. So now I just want to step back and ask, what can we glean from this overview comparison of foreign policy and artistic uses of the term intervention? I think the first is that the earliest uses of the term intervention to describe artistic gestures in public space coincides with the peak of American political intervention in Latin America in the 1970s. So the two uses are dialectically intertwined at this historical moment. They share certain qualities. Both are unsolicited, rapid, and without much regard for consequences. However, they clearly come from different positions of power. The indirect, unofficial, behind-the-scenes maneuvering of the CIA is hegemonic and imperial. Artist citizens, on the other hand, operate from a position of weakness within the enemy's field of vision. They turn to a covert, fly-by-night actions in public space, working with and against the media in order to register their dissent through disruption. The second point is that throughout artist descriptions of interventions, there's often an undercurrent of militarism and masculinism. This is evidenced readily enough in a phrase like avant-garde, used by the French military to denote a small group that went ahead of the main army. This militarism persists in the terms I've been using so far to describe this kind of work: hit and run, rapid fire, guerrilla. The last word, guerrilla, received particular traction in Latin America following the Cuban Revolution in 1959. As laid out by Che Guevara in his book Guerrilla Warfare in 1961, the emphasis is on speed and surprise. Recently, the Argentinian artist Nicolas Guagnini has suggested that artistic interventions from Latin America should be seen in the light of focismo or FOCO theory, put forward and later developed by the French intellectual and government official Régis Debray. Guagnini argues that artists throughout Latin America in the 70s were all familiar with focismo, the idea that small, fast-moving paramilitary cells could provide a focus, in Spanish foco, for political discontent and to spearhead rebellion. And this is sort of set against waiting for the right conditions to be in place. So, in classical Marxist theory, the proletariat need to be ready for revolution. So instead, focismo is about the small avant-garde, the small cell moving forward. Practitioners of electronic civil disobedience describe their operations in a similar way, referring to attacks by an elite force of cells comprising diverse expertise. So given all this military rhetoric, I'm sure the masculinism of my examples won't have escaped your attention. There's a reason, I think, why most of the examples are male and white. This kind of fast-moving, daring assertion of self in public space and cyberspace privileges those who feel secure enough to enter that space, to penetrate and claim it. And so I think with this in mind, it's important not to overlook examples of interventions that adopt a more vulnerable or meditative tone, such as, for example, Lotte Rosenfeld in Chile in the late 70s, or at the same point, Popel working in New York. Now, a third conclusion that I have is that commissioned interventions are not part of the genealogy that I'm tracing. There is a huge difference between an artist being invited to intervene in a museum collection, like Fred Wilson, and those groups or individuals who enter the museum uninvited to make their own ad hoc gesture. Paradigmatically, perhaps, the Russian artist Alexander Brenner, who went into the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and spray painted a $sign on a Malevich painting. Or the actions of Liberate Tate, an activist group who are spilling oil at Tate Britain in order to protest oil sponsorship there. The temporality of museum and biennial commissions is, I want to argue, entirely antithetical to the radical agency of self-initiated interventions. And then my final conclusion concerns the relationship between live and mediated, an action and its circulation. Interventions, I'm trying to argue through my primary example of Ensacamento, always involve mediation, refusing to establish a hard and fast line between gesture, documentation, and circulation. In the 1990s, tactical media could be said to have overvalued the public sphere as a digital sphere. By the introduction of network social media in the mid-2000s, both tactical media and activism more broadly settled into a hybrid of real bodies and data bodies, the streets and online. And this hybridity is what characterizes contemporary interventions over the last decade, which is what I'm going to turn to next. And my image here is from a relatively recent manual of disruption called Beautiful Trouble. And I think you can see from the terms here that there's not really any hard and fast line between an immediate action in the public sphere and its media circulation. So in the longer version of this paper, I now have a long theoretical section where I talk about timing, the conjuncture, seizing the right moment, and the implications of using Stuart Hall's term, a conjunctural analysis for art history and what that might do to a social history of art. But I'm going to leave that for now and just keep focusing on art. So I'm going to now turn to 3 examples of interventions from the last decade. In each case, the artist assesses a situation, makes an immediately recognizable gesture that rubs against that situation on a number of levels, drawing the attention of the public, the media, and the authorities. So my first is the Russian artist anarchist group Voina, whose name incidentally means war, while we're talking about militarism. And their gesture, Dick captured by the FSB, has been widely described as a protest or prank or stunt rather than a performance or an intervention. In the early hours of the 14th of June, 2010, incidentally, Che Guevara's birthday, or they chose that date because it's Che Guevara's birthday, the group daubed a huge and immediately recognizable penis on the Liteyny Bridge in St. Petersburg. 3 minutes later, when the drawbridge was raised, it faced the FSB building, and the FSB is the Federal Security Service, formerly the headquarters of the KGB. The group was stopped after 23 seconds before they managed to complete the left testicle, and one of the group was arrested. Footage was immediately picked up by the local news media. As Slavic scholar Oliver Johnson pithily summarizes, and I quote, "The artist only painted the image. The scheduled raising of the bridge brought it to fruition, and the internet laid it bare for all to see and participate in," unquote. So the penis functioned like a raised middle finger, but now without any euphemism. So this is not the place to rehearse the well-known events that followed, right? There's a kind of a whole long story around this, the group's nomination for an art award, winning this prize, declining to attend the award ceremony, donating the money to political prisoners, and so on. What I want to emphasize is the legibility of this public gesture, the instantly recognizable graffiti of a penis in all its puerility. I want to emphasize the virality of the image, its international circulation online, and of course, its political timing. The particular conjuncture that it intervened in concerned a moment of hatred and anger towards a corrupt government and judiciary on the part of a public with no constitutional means of escape. Putin had served 2 terms as president from 2000 to 2008, whereupon he had power switched roles with Dmitry Medvedev in order to get around the constitution, enabling him to run again for president in 2011. Given this political deadlock, Wojna responded with comic timing. Before their graffiti could be erased, the drawbridge was raised and visible to the city, completing a majestic fuck you to the FSB and by extension to Putin, who for a brief period had been its director. So Wojna's intervention was timely, not just in its response to the political deadlock, but in seizing the new possibilities of networked social media, which were rapidly becoming a tool for artists and activists to self-organize. 2 days after the intervention, Wojna's self-proclaimed ideologue, Alexei Plutsasano, published a post about the action on his blog, where he reframed it as a media action with a tripartite structure. And if you see here, it's in red. He calls it photo plus video plus text, media art. So he's claiming that the blog post itself should be seen as the artifact. Because the image was obscene, it circulated primarily online rather than in the news media, and it went viral with all of the polarizing side effects that this entails. In Russia, reactions were predictably split along political lines, from those who saw it positively as an act of political commentary to those who saw it as a symptom of moral decline requiring punishment. So in other words, I think we're dealing with a kind of iconoclash, not unlike Tres Nos Tres in Sao Paulo in 1978. Now, longer, more sustained critiques of Wojna's intervention are conspicuously unified by ambivalence. In part, this is hesitation over the juvenile character of their gesture, which trades political complexity for viral immediacy. In part, because the type of reaction it occasioned online was as crude and aggressive as the action itself. This attitude is, to an extent, an extension of the rhetoric on Wojna's website, where the group ironically states that the action was done as out of an act of patriotism to assert the power of the unconquerable Russian phallus. But I think the central issue for any of us engaging with Wojna in text longer than a tweet seems to be the group's lack of a coherent political viewpoint. Dick, captured by the FSB, could be championed and has been championed and denigrated from a wide range of political positions. At the same time, their aesthetic viewpoint is all too clear, and unfortunately, I think somewhat reactionary. For all the verve and pluck of their action, they subscribe to a romantic and masculinist outlaw hero model of the artist. And of course, this is perfectly emblematized by the choice of the icon for this graffiti gesture, a penis. So let's just pause for a moment. My second example is from Havana in Cuba. Over the last 7 years, the artist Tania Bruguera has described some of her public gestures as political timing specific, a cumbersome phrase that implies a rethinking of site specificity in terms of temporality rather than space. She uses the term to describe actions in which the social and political dynamics of a given moment are more decisive than the formal and spatial qualities of a place. Speaking primarily to her own work in the context of Cuba, she describes political timing-specific art as that which intervenes in the moment when politics are taking shape, when a new situation is emergent or taking form. It seeks to activate forces that already exist in the social or political landscape, forces like public opinion and the media that are more usually manipulated by those in power. She sees timing as a medium that politicians use and that artists might also wield to great effect. Now, the clearest example of political timing in Bruguera's own work is, by any traditional art historical measures, a failed project. It's a proposal for a public gesture to give members of the public a minute of free speech on the Plaza de la Revolución, Revolution Square. The call was taken up online, but never happened, as she was arrested before it even began. Her proposal appeared in an open letter to Raúl Castro, Barack Obama, and Pope Francis, dated the 17th of December 2014, in response to the resumption of diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba. If you remember, the Pope had served as intermediary. In her letter, the artist states that she hopes the détente will lead not just to free markets, but also to a free press and freedom of speech. She concludes by throwing down a gauntlet, inviting Raúl Castro to restage her performance, Tatlin's Whisper No. 6. And this is a participatory performance from 2009 that had taken place during that year's Havana Biennale. In the original work, which you're looking at now, members of the audience were invited onto a podium to speak freely for 1 minute, flanked by 2 actors in military dress. And one of them placed a white dove on the speaker's shoulder. And this setup was a deliberate evocation of Fidel Castro's inaugural address to the nation 50 years earlier, when white doves auspiciously landed on his shoulders, as if from heaven. So 2 days after Bruguera's open letter was published online, her challenge was taken up on social media by her sister and a curator under the hashtag Yo también exijo, which translates as I also demand. They reposted her open letter and called for citizens to gather on Revolution Square for an open mic on 30th of December at 3 p.m. T-shirts were printed, press releases were issued, a Twitter feed was established. Bruguera made video declarations about artistic actions on YouTube. The Cuban rapper Normie Queen released a song and a video of the same name. Bruguera issued another open letter, this time to Pope Francis, asking him to protect the freedom of Cubans, and another to the national newspaper, which unsurprisingly was not published. She was warned not to undertake the performance, but refused to comply. On the afternoon of 30th of December, a crowd of media gathered on Revolution Square, but the event never took place. Bruguera had been arrested at 5 a.m. that morning. Her passport was confiscated for 8 months, and during that period, she was subject to interrogations 2 or 3 times a week. But, here I want to stop, I'm already getting lured into the narration of what happened and its aftermath, a prolonged drama of move and counter-move by the artist and the government. Instead, I want to dwell on Bruguera's notion of political timing specificity that I see as central to any definition of interventions. It's clear that Yo también exijo demands a conjunctural analysis. In conventional art critical terms, it's barely conceivable as a work of art. It's a failed attempt to restage a performance. It's entirely tied to the specific moment of a possible thaw in Cuban-American relations. Obama's overture to Castro in order to end the American embargo against Cuba that had been in place since 1958. The end of this embargo and the resumption of diplomatic relations heralded the possibility of certain freedoms, Like many Cubans, Bruguera wanted to be sure that these freedoms were not just the freedom of foreign investment, but civic freedoms too, freedom of expression, of the media, and of dissent. Bruguera's open letter and Yo También Exijo grasped this structure of feeling, this new mood of possibility that informed this historical conjuncture. Yet the speed and accuracy of her intervention exposed the contradiction of that moment, that being a good revolutionary subject, loyal to the principles of the Cuban Revolution, meant going against the government, which was betraying these original principles. To be true to her revolutionary education, she had to become a dissident. So there are risks to the politically timed intervention, as Bruguera will be the first to attest. Such works can be deemed illegal, lead to house arrest, divide the public, and invite critical backlash. On top of this, the churn of social media can be fatal to artistic intentionality. In Bruguera's case, while Facebook enabled the international art world to mobilize around her plight, it also pulled the project in unexpected directions, reducing the complications and possibilities of the détente to an attack on Bruguera as an attention-seeking individual. And I can't help noticing that, this is a claim that's less frequently leveled at male artists, right? People don't say this about Ai Weiwei. Because the structure of social media is built on the individual profile, opportunity can be easily misinterpreted as opportunism, seeking the moment to advance your own career, rather than seeing it as a prefigurative portal for what Bruguera calls the not yet. And yet this inflection was certainly not helped by Bruguera's retelling of the events, in which Yo También Exijo devolves into a personal narrative of interrogations, actions, and counteractions. For example, here on the left, the artist's durational reading of a Hannah Arendt book, amplified onto the street through her window, which was in turn disrupted as the government ordered construction workers to dig up the street outside her house with noisy jackhammers. Now, such a retelling, while compelling and actually quite funny, focuses on her own drama rather than the collective plight of many other artists, musicians, and writers in Cuba. By April 2015, hashtag Yo También Exijo had become hashtag Free Tania Bruguera, even though she wasn't detained in prison, but under house arrest. Restagings of Yo También Exijo sprang up internationally in support of the artist, from Times Square, in which I was involved, to Tate Modern. Now, I've got one last example, which dates from 2017, where the young African-American artist Parker Bright decided to picket a painting during that year's Whitney Biennial. The work in question was Dana Schutz's Open Casket, a painting that depicts Emmett Till in his coffin, a Black teenager who had been killed and mutilated by white vigilantes in 1955. Bright stood in front of the painting for 2 days, wearing a T-shirt with Black Death spectacle on the back and No Lynch Mob on the front, effectively blocking a clear view of the work and inserting a living Black body in front of a dead one. It was a gesture that immediately problematized spectatorship. It literally came between, and here I want to come back to the Latin of derivative of intervention, intervenire. It came between you and the work of art. There was no neutral position available. Your race predetermined how you would be perceived in the gallery, regardless of what you actually thought of Schutz's painting. It was a thorn and very uncomfortable. Now, the Whitney Biennial is always a charged event and frequently sparks public debate and controversy. The 2017 edition was more tense than most in recent history, given the inauguration of Trump just 2 months earlier, a president who had come to power by spewing xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant, ableist, and misogynist insults. The previous year, 258 Black civilians had been killed by the police, and the summer of 2016 had been especially traumatic. The killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were recorded on video by relatives and bystanders, while the 6 officers who killed Freddie Gray were all acquitted. These events intensified the Schutz controversy and enabled it to gain more traction than previous disputes over race at the Whitney Biennial, which had last flared up in 2014 over the low numbers of artists of color represented in the show. What Bright's intervention pointed to were the limits of thinking representation in terms of numbers. Although the two curators of the 2017 biennial were Asian American, and a substantial percentage of the works were by artists of color or referenced Black history, the inclusion of Schutz's painting ignited a fierce debate over cultural appropriation and which groups in society have access to the pain and trauma of other groups. The museum, it turned out, had no curators of color on its staff, and so it had never even occurred to them that some viewers might find Schutz's painting offensive. And I'm happy to say that over the last year, during the pandemic, this debate has thankfully moved away from individual works and is now more focused on structural racism, especially museum hierarchies of staff pay, contracts, and access to benefits, all of which have been thrown into really sharp relief by the pandemic. So what these three examples demonstrate is that the media ecology in which artist activists enter today both enhances and reduces the impact of these interventions. The turbulence of social media helps to spread public knowledge of a gesture, but it also jeopardizes the level of discussion. For Voyna, for example, it descended into a set of opinions as crass as the gesture itself, outrage with no target. For Bruguera, it devolves into a focus on the individual artist rather than the production of collective solidarity. And for Bright, it led to the appropriation of his own image by another artist, the French-Algerian Neil Beloufa, in an uncanny repetition of the co-option and recontextualization that he was protesting in the work of Dana Schutz. Although social media has emerged as a useful tool for sourcing images and for measuring opinion and influence, in short, it's useful for grasping a structure of feeling, it also leads us down the path of endlessly fragmented opinions, including the artist's own. And because interventions have a parallel life online or in the media, they can get derailed and distorted, becoming overfamiliar and exhausting. They can prompt eye-rolling and fatigue. Oh no, not that again. This explosion of micro-commentary makes it difficult to focus one's attention on the larger stakes, since both the mainstream media and social media prefer to foreground the individual rather than passing cultural contradiction. And I think perhaps, looking back, this is where the 1970s intervention, with its more restricted circuits of media distribution, might have an advantage over the deregulated 21st century. Social media nevertheless helps us to diagnose the intervention as a cultural object. Interventions, unlike, I would say, most works of art collected by museums, make no claim to long-term historical transcendence or a depth model of culture. They're a guerrilla response to their moment. Because they aim to force a debate, they have no qualms about riding the attention economy. Moreover, their impetus is as civic as much as artistic. Indeed, some interventions we don't even think of as art. Think of footballer Colin Kaepernick refusing to stand during the national anthem, also in 2016, as a gesture of protest at the number of Black citizens murdered by police that summer. His gesture was emulated through Black Lives Matter protests last year, to the point where this amazing image took place. Senior Democrats wearing masks and kente cloth all followed suit. Next to this, the works of art I've been discussing seem slight in terms of their impact. But I think metrics are never the best criterion of evaluation for art or for interventions. Instead, we need to see interventions as expressive analyses of a conjuncture in their own right. Each of the three recent interventions I've shown you articulates in some way the contradictions of its historical moment. The fact that no political protest was possible apart from a 23-second graffiti of a penis. That the freedoms promised by diplomatic détente will only be economic and not civic. And that putting Black artists and Black imagery in an exhibition does nothing to change the structural racism of American culture and museums. So we're now to the final section and my conclusion, which is just a page and a half. So I want to end on the problem of moral relativism. And for this, I'm going to go back to the historical avant-garde and to futurism in the 1910s, when the futurist poets and painters embraced a nationalist ethos of war and technology, both anticipating and eventually working alongside Mussolini's fascist government. alluding to the controversial debate over whether or not Italy should enter World War I or remain neutral, the group's leader, Marinetti, described the artists as the first interventionists. He recounts a series of actions that were politically timed in support of Italy's entry into World War I, which had broken out a few weeks previously. In September 1914, the artists attended a premiere by Puccini at the Teatro dal Verme in Milan, and at the end of the first act, they unrolled an Italian flag from one gallery. From another, they tore up an Austrian flag and threw the pieces into the auditorium. The next day, they repeated this action at the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele and burned 8 Austrian flags in the nearby Piazza del Duomo. Marinetti was arrested for this gesture and spent 5 days in prison, along with 10 other members of the Futurist group. Like many of the interventions I've been tracing in this talk, the Futurist actions triangulated public gesture, political timing, and media circulation. So the uncomfortable conclusion is that disruptive and transgressive interventions, like any other artistic strategy or medium, cannot be automatically aligned with left or right, good or bad, however we construe them. And I want to put up this pairing of images from the last 12 months. So a year ago, last June, people started putting graffiti on and putting a sort of symbolic red as blood, red paint as blood, on statues of Confederate generals and of Christopher Columbus in protest in support of Black Lives Matter. And then in January this year, pro-Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C., dressed in this kind of way, and also taking photos of themselves next to monumental statuary. So in her work on, I'm just going to leave that pairing there. In her work on the alt-right, critic Angela Nagel has shown how transgression and subversion are ideologically flexible, politically fungible, morally neutral, and can characterize misogyny as easily as it can sexual liberation. Anti-moral transgression has always been a bargain with the devil because the case for equality is essentially a moral one, unquote. So I think this tension, right, between the political and the moral is exhibited in many of the examples of interventions I've shown you. In many cases, they speak more to issues of freedom of speech or the freedom to protest, than to issues of equality, redistribution, or justice. The exception, of course, is Parker Bright, whose intervention subjects artistic freedom to morality. And I think it's no accident that his intervention takes place in a museum rather than on the streets. So all of this political undecidability shouldn't leave us adrift and rudderless, but give us a clearer sense of the task ahead. Any analysis of interventions needs to take the next step, which is a discussion of ends as well as means. A nihilist, libertarian politics of transgression is substantially different from a politics of equality, justice, and futurity, as opposed to futurism. Interventions can spiral headlong into violence and hatred, but they can also be prefigurative, a way to generate glimpses of the not yet, channeling the rebellious energies of a desire for a life that could be, although what that comprises and for whom will, of course, differ from context to context. And so that's the end. I just want to leave you with this beautiful image at the end, which is another monument to a Confederate general in the South, in Richmond, Virginia, last summer, which protesters covered in graffiti. But they're more than just covering it in graffiti. As you can see, it's particularly beautiful, vibrant, colorful graffiti. It's also become a social space. It's become a space of grief and mourning, but also for projected images. It's also a buzz with life. It's a place for playing games, for cooking, for eating, dancing. There's a radical library. So in other words, it's a place for collective grief and memorialization, while also being a vital incubator for an empowered Black future. And I think this, for me, this starts to show the difference between futurism and futurity as these two contrasting terms that I want to put out for discussion. Thank you. That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much. What an amazing presentation. I was very I was really impressed by your talk and the images you showed. That's great. So I changed my language to Japanese to here. Okay.
Thank you very much. Truly, truly wonderful presentation. And there were a variety of images that you showed us. And I felt quite emotional. Now, going forward, we would like to open it up to the floor in general. But before that, we have two discussants. And we'd like them to join in. And regarding the Q&A corner, if you have a question, either in English or in Japanese, maybe if it's in English, then Dr. Bishop can read it directly and answer us. But you can send in your questions in Japanese as well if you like. We will translate it in one way or another. And as long as time allows, we'd like to have questions and answers. And the first discussant is Mr. Shinya Sugawara. And Sugawara-san, regarding Dr. Claire Bishop, relatively speaking, regarding what she says, and Tania Bruguera that she was talking about, regarding the dialogue, Sugawara-san has written critiques on this. And a week ago, all of us, we're a university, so we got the students together and we held a pre-session, and Sugawara-san talked about recent Dr. Bishop's papers and essays, and he has contributed a lot. And this time, in inviting him, we want him to make a comment first and then ask some good questions. So that's why we've asked him to join us. So Sugawara-san, please go ahead. Yes. Thank you, Professor Mōri, and good morning. This is Shinya Sugawara speaking. Dr. Bishop, thank you for a wonderful lecture. And Dr. Bishop, in 2019, at Artforum, you announced Rise to the Occasion. So this is about Tania Bruguera, and you talked about intervention and political timing specific art and conjuncture, and you talked about these concepts. And 2 years have passed, and in today's lecture, I feel that the discussion back then has now been expanded and has also been deepened. It's more profound. And regarding this lecture, I would like to make a few comments, and then I'd like to ask Dr. Bishop 2 questions. Dr. Bishop, in the past, in Artificial Hells, talked about a secondary audience and how important this secondary audience is. In a nutshell, a secondary audience is people who cannot take part in the participation-type artworks. So they could not take part in the work. However, what happened at the site through photographs, images, video, text, if they have been documented, then these kinds of secondary audiences later on can experience the work in a variety of ways. Therefore, through the documentation, a work can go beyond the site and reach a lot of people. At today's lecture, between live and what's mediated, the relationship, and between the street and online, the discussion of the relationship, I believe, takes the intervention in Artificial Hell and has updated it into a new context. And regarding intervention, in the actions in a public space have gone beyond the site to reach a lot of people. But to do this, it needs to be documented and it needs to be distributed over media. So this kind of thing, Dr. Bishop was talking about this regarding site-specific art. And in a more broader way, we can think about this related to specificity. To experience site-specific art, the audience need to go to the site where the work is being done. And the work cannot be cut away from the site where it's held because it has a close relationship with the site. Therefore, in site-specific art, a typical artist is Richard Serra. And to quote Richard Serra, he says, "To remove the work is to destroy the work." However, just physically removing the work, that is not necessarily the same as moving the work. if you document the work through photographs and distribute it over media, that also means removing the work. So the work, as photographs or as video, can move away from the site, and through media, it can expand to a variety of locations. So the image of the work on the media is no longer site-specific. And actually, Richard Serra says he's taken photographs of his own site-specific works, and he was negative about this happening and moving away from the site. So Dr. Bishop, in her lecture, talked about intervention and gave us a variety of examples. And in various physical sites, it's not just actions at that site, but taking video of the actions and having it expanded or disseminated over the newspaper and internet is important. That's what she was saying. And there are works that have the basic premise of being distributed over the media. And some are being done for the media. So when interventions are taking place in a physical public space, then the government or authorities may come and erase it, or it may not be seen by a large number of people. So it's only a small number of people who see it. So by utilizing media, the impact can be much, much larger. That's probably the reason. However, the image of recording interventions means moving it away from the original site, and it means it becomes distributed. However, it does not mean that the intervention and the actual site where it takes place are not necessarily cut away from each other. A certain intervention may need to be done at that specific site. It can continue to be site-specific, but at the same time, through media, it can go beyond the physical site and be disseminated in a variety of places, and then it loses its specificity. Therefore, an intervention is linked to the location and also the situation. So it has specificity. However, I believe it also has universality that goes beyond the specificity. So from the lecture, I'd like to quote an example. Tania Bruguera was put under house arrest, and there were protest movements, #Free Tania Bruguera. And this movement was developed in a variety of locations across the world. So I think you can say that regarding a specific site, through Bruguera, there were interventions, and through the media, it went beyond the location, the site, and it led to global collaboration. So in that respect, I think it expresses its universality. Don't you think so? That's my first question. And my comment and question were mainly regarding the site. But in Dr. Bishop's lecture, she was emphasizing the issue of time, temporality. And I have another question about the time as well. Interventions are prefigurative. And there's direct intervention in the current moment. And they try to bring about a certain future. Not yet. So this covers both the current and also the future. But what's lacking is the past. And before, in Radical Museology, Dr. Bishop talked about dialectical contemporaneity. I'd like to quote from Radical Museology. Rather than succumbing to this presentism, a tiger's leap into that which has gone before may be supremely relevant to mobilizing an understanding of our situation. Dialectical contemporaneity is therefore an anachronic action that seeks to reboot the future through the unexpected appearance of a relevant past. So that was the quotation. In that case, the action of intervention in the same way, is there room for a past to exist? And if the past does exist, what kind of past is that? Those are the two questions that I have. That's all from myself. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sugawara-san. Thank you for turning that all into a text for us. So, Dr. Bishop, Would you like to respond? What do you think?
Sure. Yes. No, these are great questions. So, as I understand, the first question is really about site specificity. And yes, I appreciate everything you're saying about site specificity. At the same time, by trying to develop a theory of political timing specificity, I want to move away from that discourse and the way we've traditionally thought about the physical site and then the documentation of the physical site, right, which are always two separate things. And instead, I want to try and think these things together and emphasize timing. The things that we don't see in an image are often around questions of timing. As you were talking to me, I was reflecting back on that, one of those early Russian examples that I gave you of the guys lying down on the floor outside Lenin's mausoleum. So sure, it's very important that it's red square, that it's in front of Lenin's mausoleum. But I think even more important is that it's 3 days after a law has been passed prohibiting foul language in public, and that it's done on Che Guevara's birthday, right? Those are the things you can't get in a photograph. And yet these are things about timing that I think are really, really important. So it's a response, it's a quick, rapid response to a situation that is temporal more than it is a question of physical sight. It's always amusing and awful when people try and connect your past work to your present work, because you never think in those terms as a writer, especially me. I'm very siloed. Something I've done in the past I don't want to think about anymore, and I'm on a new project. So it's always interesting when people force these ideas into juxtaposition. So this question of the secondary audience in artificial hells, I'm always very adamant that what I'm arguing in that book is not a plea for documentation, understood as photographs, but instead of multiple possibilities of conveying the significance or the experience of a participatory action to a future audience. So it's something that is, there's not necessarily photographs. It could also be stories or or videos or an oral history or rumor and any other. There are many other modes outside of photographic documentation. But I think the difference between that type of secondary audience and the one that is implicit in the talk I gave tonight is the difference between control and uncontrolled. Right? So when an artist decides how to present their participatory project to a secondary audience, there's usually a set of clear decisions made about what images, footage, how it's framed, as an artist talk or a narrative. These things are all carefully parsed. And I think with this kind of work, and especially in the recent interventions and their use of social media, this becomes something very uncontrolled, very fast. And so to the extent that I think the site of this work is perhaps the media more than the physical site. And because of that, there is something that the artist has to really relinquish control over the way in which the action, the intervention is framed and disseminated. As for whether this is, this point you raise about universality, my instinct is to push back on this. I think there's, we lose a lot of the specificity of the historical conjuncture of the timing when we start to think about the move from "I also demand" to "free Tania Bruguera." Sure, it went global, but a lot was lost in it becoming a campaign to free the artist rather than a situation, a kind of collective demand for different types of freedoms to be instituted through the détente with the US in 2014. So I would really want to push back on the universality, in part because I'm trying to elaborate a model of, an artistic strategy that is really not a depth model of a cultural artifact. Now, this is not something that is a work of art that has trans-historical ramifications that will be collected by museums and will be relevant for decades and maybe centuries even to come, right? This is usually the criteria that museums usually bring to their decisions to acquire works for their collection. Instead, these are works that are often, they're not even really works, I think sometimes, they're often called pranks, or they're, in the case of Bruguera, they're failures. These are things that have their status is more slight. These are not weighty cultural artifacts. And I think something that maybe reinforces that is the degree to which, when you start talking about one of these in the context where it happened, people become bored very, very quickly. They're over it. They're done. They don't want to think about this particular problem anymore. In that respect, it's interesting presenting this material in this context in Tokyo. So then this second question about prefigurative time, I would say not all interventions are prefigurative, right? My point at the end is precisely to say they can't really be aligned with left or right. There are right-wing interventions, there are left-wing interventions, there are some which are really anarchic. And actually, I think if there is a dominant mode, it's an anarchic mode that really can't fit into a political schema. So I think only sometimes there's an intervention that has that seeks a prefigurative mode to bring about a politics of the not yet. So the question then about what about the past? I think I would say that interventions are really a forward-facing mode, and this is the place that they have in my current book project. There is another chapter deals with works of art that look backwards at modernism, and these are not historical. These are not historical works. They're dealing with the present and how to shift consciousness about the present. They want to change public perception of the present. And I really don't think there's a large investment in history at all. But, what comes to my mind through your question was a section in the Regis Debray book that I showed halfway through the PowerPoint, Revolution in the Revolution, where he talks about the importance of Fouquismo, of guerrilla warfare, being about precisely not doing things the way it's always been done before. Right? So it's not about waiting for the right conditions for revolution. It's not about waiting for the proletariat to be ready to take up arms and sacrifice everything for a revolution. Instead, it's about seizing the moment and moving forward quickly and not really even knowing the outcome. And so it's that, they are presentist to a degree, but I think there's usually a hope for something else to change embedded within that present day response. But their mode of temporality, I would say, is really in the tradition of much of the historical avant-garde and is forward facing. So I hope that answers your questions. But thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It would be best if we could have this dialogue, but if we have time later, maybe I will ask Sugawara-san to comment again. But let's move forward because we have another discussant, artist, Koki Tanaka. And concerning style and methodology, I believe Tanaka-san has many ideas that would be common with what we've heard. And also 2 years ago, at the Aichi Triennale, I believe that you were involved in that activity, and also you have been speaking from a political standpoint as well, and from your viewpoint as an artist as well as art critique. And now I'd like to ask you for your comment and question. Thank you very much. And I would like to speak in English.
I'm going to talk in English, even though my English isn't perfect, but I prefer to have a more conversational rather than just commentary. So, but I actually prepared 3 slides. So I'm just going to share my screen. So first, it was really great to have your talk, which is really, really rich and amazing talk. I think the Japanese audience wait for your talk since, I don't know, like 5 years or something. And finally, you gave a talk. It's really great. So today I'm going to actually in the very beginning, before I got your text, I was actually thinking about to. I'm actually remember first time when we met in Münster. You told me that the Japanese artists are just making a shiny objects, and and I tried to. So I wanted you to rethink about it, and because that after the disaster, the tsunami and nuclear disaster in Japan, many of the Japanese artists becoming more political or more socially engaged, and even there was a couple of also important social intervention by different artists. So I thought it might be good to give you some of the example of those like a Japanese contemporary art right now. But I know that I only have like 10 minutes to give you a question. So maybe we can, if we have another time, maybe we can talk about it. So first, I wanted to make a short comment on your lecture today and relationship to the yesterday's lecture about the research-based art. I made sort of like a list of terminology and also some ideas you throw. Compare with the your earlier argument about the antagonism and the relational aesthetics. I know that you already say that you don't want to compare your earlier argument with the recent one, but still, I think it's nice to kind of like a bridge between your earlier arguments to the present to the Japanese audience, because antagonism and the relational aesthetics, your text is well circulated in the Japanese art scene. So because the lecture yesterday, it was only for the student in global art and Geidai students. So I just sum up your arguments, which towards the end of your lecture, you problematize the research-based art. So in the recent context of the internet, research-based art is characterized as a display of overall its aggregation of random, subjective, ready-made archive. Artists accumulate, so this is my interpretation, but the artists accumulate information just like we do Googling and put together to show it to viewers without certain narrative as non-linear way. So spectators' response is either skimming or sampling of huge information in front of them, so that they are not much engaged, but just browsing it. So when you criticize about the research-based art, it somehow reminds me the project by the group of artists from the relational aesthetics, because what they're doing is open-ended, which is related to this overall informations, because it's like an endless accumulation that the artist is doing, which is also open-ended, and which is also like non-linear way that they just gather, cooking together, eating together, something like that. And most of the things happening in the relational aesthetic is commissions or doing in the white cube, not in the public space. So which is also related to the differentiate of like intervention and the research-based art. And also like consensus versus like a dissensus or disruption. And relational aesthetics is also referred to the art history, like how they change the discourse of the art history, not the society or political agenda. And also relational aesthetics or research-based art could be read as like a slow slowness in a way. And this is also, for me, it's a comparison between the art and activism. So social intervention is more like activism, and research-based art, because it's art, so art. And also the relational aesthetic is more for art. In a way, it's art for art, in a way. So the list I made here is kind of like two contradictory of the your lecture yesterday and today on the research-based art intervention. And I really appreciate of like this two different categories you contextualize from the history and also the present time. Wait, sorry. Okay, so I also remember that you mentioned in the antagonism and the relational aesthetics about the quality of it's a problem of the quality of the social relational aesthetics, because it's hard to grasp as a end result. So because it's open-ended, it's difficult to capture the edge of what is art, what is work or not. So I also raise the question of like what the quality of the research and what the quality of the intervention too. And within the lecture yesterday, you also talk about this quality of the research, which is, this is also my interpretation, but that is like how to navigate the audience in overloaded archives information. So narrative, you didn't use the term, but the poetic surplus, which is you used, that's the kind of like a way to make the quality, find the quality of the research, I think, because you're talking about the research versus search. So search is without narrative or poetic surplus, but the research has to have kind of like a direction in a way. But I don't know, you can talk, like you can respond to this or not, but here's my questions. The first one is skip, because I found that there is so many questions to you now from the audience. So I just wanted to go to the second one and third one. So I'm just going to read, like, why right-wing politics or alt-right movement use disruptive or transgressive interventions to our life, how much your idea of intervention could alter and against such a reality. And the third question is I know there is a term curatorial activism, but even a critic and a historian like you should be expected to be as an activist too in public sphere outside of institutions, because you admire intervention to be held in the street. So what art historians' activism should be? Maybe this is too big, or I don't know, you're not expecting something like that.
Okay, thank you, Koki.
Thank you.
Wow, there's a lot to get hold of there. My God, that chart, that's terrible. I'm so embarrassed that I told you that my impression of Japanese art was all about shiny objects. You know, I'd been to, I think I was last in Japan in 2010, and I'd been to the Mōri Art Museum.
Okay.
And the exhibition at Mōri had really struck me as, yes, it wasn't even so much that it was shiny, but there was just intense craftsmanship and technical detail.
Yeah,
and,
I understand that. Yeah.
But yes, and of course, after Fukushima, I was aware of, of so much more, including our own work, that had come to the fore in Japanese art. So yes, you're right to point to this, suspicion of open-endedness. This is something that I'm aware of in my work, and I'm trying to fight it somehow, because I'm worried that there's something rather conservative about a suspicion of open-endedness, and it, and it puts me in a lineage with someone like Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood essay from 1967, which is also a suspicion of open-endedness. And so I'm very wary of going too far down the line. I'm always struggling to try and embrace something more. And going through this idea of poetic surplus is maybe my way of trying to find, because I don't want to hold artistic research to the same standards as academic research. And I would prefer there was some cross-pollination and mutual creativity infecting each of these two domains. So that's, the open-endedness is one term that I'm a little jumpy about. And of course, antagonism is the other one. And pretty soon after my book Artificial Hells was published in 2012, and living in America and seeing what was happening in politics, I realized we were entering a new political conjuncture. And so much of Artificial Hells was tied to the specific conditions of the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, and the sort of neoliberal consensus of centrist politics, where there was really not that much significant difference between the center left and the center right. These were the two options that we had. And of course, after, or maybe during Obama's second presidency, that started to implode and fracture. And the differences became far more extreme. And all of my theory about antagonism as a way to puncture neoliberal consensus totally went out of the window. And I had to completely rethink that my attachment to that tradition of disruption. And part of that is also then, being aware of, more aware of feminist and an artist by blacks, so arguments by Black scholars about, there's a certain privilege to the disruptive position, and it led to a questioning of, the privileging of male artists in my work. And I've really tried to, step back from that a little bit. And I think you can see maybe in the lecture I gave tonight, there's, for as much as I admire people doing interventions, I also have an unease and a skepticism as well about the value of these. So I'm trying. I think now I'm more mature. I'm more balanced. What can I say? But the political situation changes, and then your values change, and particularly after Trump's presidency, where we're in a situation of pretty much civil war here. There's perpetual antagonism, and so we need to think through different artistic and political strategies for moving forward. So, and then the other word you used, quality. Oh my God. Yeah, that's another one I have a strange relationship to, and quality in English for me has connotations of excellence, which I want to kind of get away from. It's something a little connoisseurial, a little conservative. So I'm struggling to find, these other key terms that one can use. And it's a constant struggle for me to find, I turn to words like, compelling, which implies that it's holding me, it's keeping my attention, it's keeping me interested. But these aren't good substitutes at the end of the day. So to come to your question specifically, given, the rise of right-wing interventionism, how can interventions, in a way, it's a funny question. How can interventions alter the reality of interventions? I don't know. We're in some strange, zero-sum game here, because if the game is really media attention and disruption as a value, then nobody's going to win. It's a kind of a bonfire of antagonism. So I really want to try and those last two paragraphs where I'm trying to switch it to think about futurity and what can be produced, how to imagine the not yet. I've become more interested in speculative types of writing. So as a critic, rather, for example, 2 years ago, when MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, reopened after a big redevelopment and expansion, I went to look at the collection. I was asked to review it. I didn't want to write a conventional review that just criticized everything I disliked in this hang and the value system behind it. Instead, I wrote a review together with my partner, Nikki, that was a speculative review that imagined what could have been. And that exercise was so much more satisfying as a way of projecting the world that you want to see. And so I am more interested in, prefigurative modes of art making and speculation as a way to try and will into existence, to do the imaginative work of thinking through what could be. Because once you have an idea of it, it's much easier to move towards it. So that would be my answer to your second question. And then the activism, curatorial activism, as I understand it, tends to be inside an institution. It's about showing a more diverse roster of artists, more women, more artists of color, more overlooked minorities, and so on. So I'm not sure what the equivalent of an art historian's activism would be. It could do similar things in terms of paying attention to the kind of works that you want to focus on, that you want to give focus on. But that's not your question. Your question is more about being outside the institution. I would say I'm a bad activist. I'm not a very good activist. I'm much more interested in researching and writing. My partner is a good activist, and I thrive on my discussions with her. Where am I going with this? I do think that I feel very proud to be at an institution that has a very strong track record of public engaged scholarship, with some fantastic intellectuals that are my colleagues in the faculty, who do precisely that kind of work of being a public intellectual, whether they're writing on prison reform or the rise of neoliberalism or this imagining new political modes of being. I have wonderful colleagues, and I feel like I'm in the right kind of context for my work rather than a private university. But I don't really know how to think about art historians' activism in a way. It would take me a little bit of time to think about what that would be. But I think the last year, the combination of the political upheavals here in the wake of Trump's presidency and through Black Lives Matter and the pandemic have really forced a reckoning with what we think of as the discipline. And I've really tried to shake that a little bit through how I teach some of the core courses in our department, such as methods. But I can tell you more about that another time.
Okay. So thank you very much.
We have questions from people.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. Can you see the Q&A box?
Yeah, should I look at Q&A or chat?
Q&A.
Okay.
And maybe we have already 2 hours discussion, so maybe can we have another 10 minutes to? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Let's go for another 10 minutes. Could you curate the questions for me though? There are too many to. Which one?
Yeah. So I was maybe. We had a question from a Russian student, and can I read it? Ekaterina Kazmina. Can you? Okay, I'm going to read it. Professor Bishop, thank you so much for the inspiring lecture. I came from Russia, so I was very pleased to see some Russian reference in lecture. But let me share a brief comment regarding the latter. Boyner's action is indeed a colorful example of artistic media intervention, a spectacular way. Yet, in my opinion, unfortunately, it demonstrates the artist withdrawal from the dialogue. The more inappropriate gesture is, the easier it can be dismissed. So this is, I would say, the general problem with such art practice. These days, more than ever before, we need to find a way to be heard by those in power, at least in Russia. And unfortunately, this type of art cannot be of any help. Thus, it seems to be it is not suitable for activism and political struggle. So this is a comment from Russia. So can you make a?
I mean, I hope it came across in my discussion of Voina that I'm ambivalent at best about that action, and I think I taught this subject in a class this semester, and we had a long discussion about about Vojna and activism, and to what extent it could really even be called activism, because of their political undecidability. I mean, the group are anarchists and don't really, and it can't really be. A gesture like that can't really be mobilized towards any, substantial political goals. But I think its value is probably as an expression of dissent, just a pure expression of dissent. That in turn, I think, it catalyzed other things. Like, so a year later you have Pussy Riot, and a year later you start to have the formation of more focused activist groups become possible in Russia as a result of these simplistic and juvenile ruptures, but ones which are necessary first expressions of dissent. Although I'm also wary that my language there was a little primitivizing. So it's complicated. It's interventions have a value they seek media attention, but they're not always, they're not necessarily profound.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to pick up another question from Arai-san, Mr. Arai. I hope you can read it, but I will read it. I'd like to ask a question. In 2016, Anish Kapoor was invited to exhibit his work, Dirty Corners, in the garden of the Palace Museum in Versailles. So where he displays his work, Dirty Corner, in the garden, caused very big controversy and vandalism, when the artist himself said it was a Marie Antoinette's vagina. Why the Palace of Versailles asked the artist to intervene in the palace, Kapoor intervened in a political way, which other party didn't want. So this related the issue of censorship. But how do you think the artist can make a real intervention, even in the case of the commissioned work?
I think it's really hard. Again, I tried to say this in the lecture, but I realized it was very dense and there was a lot of information. But I'm really not sure that a commissioned intervention can really have much traction. You're invited to come and create trouble. You're invited to make a disruption, and that from the very beginning that defangs the possibilities of what can be done. At best, it's an arrangement that suits both parties very well. And there's always a gesture of containment and neutralization through the process of commissioning, whether it's and it's often a museum, and it's often outsourced to the artist to create this disruption rather than being something that the curators feel comfortable doing themselves. I don't know this particular example though. I'm curious. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, actually, you got a similar questions from different persons because probably because particularly within the East Asian context, I mean, kind of always government try to control everything. So in the gallery or museum, so most of the artworks, well, not most of, but it's very difficult for artists to do a guerrilla artwork in the street or outside of the institution. Maybe that is another. Yeah. Okay.
There's an interesting question here about like the mid-60s and the Tokyo Olympics.
Yes.
And, artists making interventions, and of course, I'm aware of High Red Center, and I think this is super interesting, and I would love to look more into this because I do think this way of working is global. It's not universal, but it's global because in every context there's a desire to dissent from authority, and often the same, very similar strategies are used over and over again. Speed, guerrilla tactics, public space, the media, and so on. So yes, thanks for those references. I'll definitely look into them.
Okay. Maybe we can choose only one more questions. Professor Bishop, can you choose any of them?
Oh my God, I'm reading so fast. It's so hard. there was something here about if timing specificity is central to intervention, how can one reenact an intervention? I'm not sure you can, actually. I mean, it's a discussion I've had with Tania Bruguera about whether her pieces can be reenacted. And, you know, for her, it's not about reenacting, it's redoing, rehacer. And redoing is understanding that the context and the set of questions have changed and that there are new urgencies that need to be responded to. But I'm not totally sure that then, you know, the same strategies can be deployed if the questions have changed. And especially if the media context has changed. I do think, you know, the conditions of media circulation and dissemination are very determining of this work. Oh my God, there's lots of questions. I can't go through all these. I'm not taking it in.
I think maybe we have to give up a kind of answering everything. So eventually I'm going to send all questions to you. And, after translating some of the Japanese text, and I hope you can reply when you have a time next time. So, and probably.
I just wondered if Shinya Sugawara wanted to come back to me on anything, or Koki wanted to respond back, you know, to make it more of a conversation.
That's true. Sugawara-san, 最後ちょっと
Sugawara-san, would you like to respond to the answers to your question? Yes, Dr. Bishop, thank you very much. So, Dr. Bishop, in one of your books in the past, you talked about how you've changed your position. And the position, you said, has changed. And what was it? So in Artificial Hell and Radical Museology, I understand your position, but you said you've changed from antagonism and related aesthetics, but I'd like to say thank you for your response. That's all from myself. Tanaka-san, this is a good opportunity. Would you like to respond to the answers?
One of the reason why Mōri-san is invited you to this lecture, he actually told me that this conversation, your lecture, is not only like for this time. He's expecting to continue for the future, because Kazuya-san, Shimizu-san from yesterday, they were also mentioned about there is many like interventions or media circulation of the intervention in Asia. So it could be also nice to introduce you to those artist works or activist movement. So hopefully the COVID-19 is finished in, I don't know, end of this year or next year. Then you can come back to Japan.
Yes, no, that would be great. Yeah.
So I think we have to finish anyway this great lecture. But the thing is, you know, like Koki-san said, I hope to kind of invite you actually physically to Japan, but unfortunately because of the COVID-19, we cannot make that. But next time, I really hope we invite you again to Japan to continue the discussion, and probably we can keep in touch and have another chance to discuss.
Yeah, no, this is a great start, and I definitely want to know more about East Asian art. So this is a great opportunity to start a conversation. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate today's lecture. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm not quite sure how to close this, but thank you. Right, so I'm not quite sure how to end this. It's rather difficult how to end an online lecture. Maybe we should applause. Normally we'd applause, but maybe not online. And Sugawara-san, Tanaka-san, thank you very much. You were a great contribution. I apologize for being a not-so-good moderator. And Q&A, I used that for the first time in my life. And there were so many questions. I understand now it's very difficult to process them all. But from our side, we have read all of the questions, and those in Japanese, if possible, we will translate them into English and give them to Dr. Bishop. And if you have any thoughts, we'd like to provide her with what we thought. And earlier on, towards the end, as Tanaka-san was saying, in this way, Dr. Bishop has been to Japan in the past, but her speaking in public like this, I'm not quite sure if we can say today was in Japan, but I think this has been a good opportunity. So in some way or another, I hope we can continue the discussion. And it's true, the situation in East Asia, not just in Japan, but in the whole of Asia, something great is now going on, or big things are going on economically and politically, and the artists in response. The artists are creating movements. So I don't really think we can easily collaborate, but at a minimum, regarding the information, methodology, I hope we can exchange opinions. So thank you very much for taking part today. Thank you very much.